And our workshop, it is 5:30. Our topic will be Equity Audit Report Workshop. I want to welcome everyone here. And at this period of time, I would like to ask for any public comment. Is there any public comment? We have 3 minutes per individual. I'm not seeing a mad rush for public comment, so we'll probably open it up at the end of the meeting too. At this period of time, I'm going to turn it over to our city manager, Rebecca Fleury, for introductions.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. I appreciate you being here for this workshop. This feels like a journey that we've been on for a long time. It started pre-COVID, if we can all remember back that far. At the time, the city was experiencing many of the things that the nation has experienced around the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a lot of conversations in the community and wanting to express concerns through vigils and marches and all of those things. And during all of that, there was a constant stream of communication between the Urban League, the police department, and the city manager's office. And one of the requests that came from the Urban League, specifically from the African American Collaborative, was the ask of the city to undertake an equity audit. And to be honest, I remember the conversation very clearly. Chief Blocker and I think we probably both looked at each other and like, well, we're not really sure what that is. As a governmental organization and a unit of local government, you know, that's not usually a request, nor is it something that I was familiar undertaking. Certainly had seen some of the work in nonprofits in the community, but never really from a government organization. So it was important that the city become an active listener in what we were being asked to undertake. And I was so, it was such a good feeling, and we were very fortunate that we had some of these community leaders step up and help and guide us through this process. So let me give a huge thank you to Kyra Wallace, Ellie Johnson, Dr. Nakia Bayless, and Dr. Alicia Johnson, who were the group of the African American Collaborative that really helped the city prepare a scope of work, put that in a city format to issue an RFP, and then to actually interview those consultants that applied, that had responded, I should say, to be considered for the group that worked with the city of Battle Creek and the African American Collaborative to complete an equity audit. And so we were able to, I think there were 5 organizations in which we interviewed, and we were probably intimidating because the interview team included not only myself, Chief Blocker, and purchasing, but it also included the members of the African American Collaborative. Because again, we relied on them for the scope of work and in a territory that the city was not familiar. So appreciated them being part of that team, and then ultimately that group with the city's team selected MGT Consulting. And it was a competitive group of responses to our RFP, and to our surprise, it was national. We had a couple of local responders, but really when we looked at the responsiveness to the scope of work and the experience of those that applied or responded to the RFP, it really was MGT. They had done this work, this similar work in other municipalities, and we just really felt that their interview gave us confidence that they could meet the scope of work that we had asked, but also understood this is new territory for the city and would be our partner along the way. And so really that happened before COVID and then COVID. So there was a great deal of delay, and we all experienced that in every aspect of our personal and professional lives. And so it took us longer than we had anticipated to complete the scope of work. That scope included 2 phases for the city. It included a human resources component, an internal look at the city's human resource systems, policies, processes, practices, with the intent of answering the question is, do we look like the community that we serve from an employee-based perspective? because some of the feedback that we had received in community conversations was we were not, and that made it uncomfortable for some of our community members to access city services. So that was a really important one, but it was also a chance to look introspectively. As a unit of local government, we have a lot of bureaucratic documents, and many of them inform how we function as a unit of local government. Very important: charter, ordinances, administrative code, and I appreciate that MGT was not afraid to kind of dive into some of those documents, which is not the easiest. So that was our first phase. The second phase focused on community police relations, but the methodology was the same for both. The first step was for the MGT team to take a look at all of our internal documents. So I just shared with you kind of what they looked at from an HR perspective, but they also looked at our job descriptions, our postings, our handbooks, anything that would be involved in human resource processes at the city. For phase two, the community police relations, same start. They looked internally to the police department and looked at all of the policies and practices and procedures that were already in place. And then both phase one and phase two included community conversations. So as you can imagine, for the human resources phase one, it was all about engaging with employees. So they did focus groups and interviewed employees on a voluntary basis. You know, we didn't voluntold any employee. It was on a volunteer basis. But we certainly did our best to try to encourage employees, particularly those that had concern in this particular area, so that we can understand, you know, what were we doing well and where our gaps are, what are we not doing well from an employee perspective. And so they did that. And then from the community police relations side, they went to the community themselves and did their best to hold community conversations in person and virtually to be able to gather that input. I think most of you know it's very difficult to engage the community right now in a variety of things, whether it's surveys, conversations, one-on-ones, focus groups. It is just really hard right now. And I think in both phases, while we wished we had more participation, we know and have always said this is just the first step in a really big step that the city is on as an organization, a journey, our equity journey, to make sure that we are breaking down any barriers that we have that's preventing us from being, you know, an equitable organization. So we advanced all of those things with the help of MGT, and they really did a good job. You know, they asked really good questions to try to get to know the city as an organization and the community at first before they went out and tried to engage the community. And so what you're going to hear tonight, and that you've all received the full report, and it is very large. You know, there's not going to be a quiz about every page. And then you kind of got some snapshots of both phases, snapshots of the human resources phase as well as the community police relations phase. Also during this process, we did our best to keep the Human Relations Board fully involved in what we were doing and where we were at. We did our best to do that. MGT did at least 2 presentations to the Human Relations Board about methodology, their engagement, and then ultimately the draft report and kind of one-pagers. So really appreciated the input there. And you know, we heard some tough things about, hey, we don't think you engaged enough people from the staff perspective and the community perspective, and we recognize that and acknowledge that and lift that up. But what we've always said, or what I have always said, is that this is, again, just step 1. There are a lot more questions to be asked. But from the perspective of the scope of work that we provided MGT as our consultant to do this, we felt that they had covered it to the best of their ability. I also appreciated that the Human Relations Board asked for a statement from the African American Collaborative. Help us understand what you were thinking at the time you talked to the commission, or you talked to the city and you asked them to do the equity audit, and you know, you prepared the scope, and then what do you think now? You have the draft report, you have the executive summaries, I will call them. And you have a copy of their letter. You received that this week, and the Human Relations Board received that at their meeting last week. And overall, while I don't profess to speak for the African American Collaborative, I think that they viewed this as a positive first step, and that it did achieve the goals that they were thinking at the time it was asked. They certainly did understand there was a great deal of time that passed from the time they asked to when we finished, but recognize, you know, a global pandemic does make things slow down quite a bit. And that we will continue to work with the community about what the next steps look like. You know, the scope always included the creation of a diversity, equity, inclusion action plan. It's that first step in the roadmap for the city about where we're headed next. And what that looks like, you know, we're still working on that. We want to make sure that the commission receives this information, asks questions of the consultant, and then works with my administration to figure out what those next steps are. And I will take guidance and counsel from the Human Relations Board, from the commissioners, from the community about what those next steps will be. And of course, the African American Collaborative and any other organization that wants, you know, to talk about what the next steps look like. MGT has been always open to that. They knew this is like a snapshot in time. Somebody said this is like the first baby step. Yes. You know, our organization's equity journey is underway, but we know we're at different phases in different areas, and we will continue to look introspectively to that and work with our community about where we're headed. So with that, I will stop talking, and I will turn this over to Lamont Brown from MGT Consulting, and he's going to walk you through the final report from the city's equity audit.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. You can see on the next slide, it just kind of gives an overview of what I'm going to present today, but certainly open for any questions that come up. The one thing that I will echo from Rebecca is the idea that this is a step. There are some folks who wish to do an audit or wish to do an assessment and talk to the community and think that it's going to be one solution to a whole lot of problems, and it's not the case. And so the city has definitely demonstrated their understanding that this is a step. It's a big step, but it's going to take a lot more going forward. So what I hope to share with you is our approach, our findings, our recommendations, and then at the very end, the plan that we help facilitate creating, and then talk about what that looks like for the city going forward. Just a little bit about MGT. We are a national public sector consulting firm based out of Tampa, Florida. I personally live in Denver, Colorado. Most of our work, a large majority, is public sector with city and state organizations, as well as counties. We have a variety of services, as you can see, but I have the fortunate pleasure of leading the DEI service, which is, as you can imagine, our fastest and largest growing offering for the organization. You can see on the screen that there are a host of clients that we have had over the last several years across the country doing one form or another of a DEI assessment, training, or strategic planning. What's interesting about the one we did for Battle Creek is that it did involve the police and police community relations, which is not something that we've seen holistically across all of our clients. The other thing that was unique about this is that while there was a component on relations between the community and the police department, the focus was also on internal. And so while we did engage the community to get feedback on police community relations, the community did not get feedback on overall, experiences as a resident of Battle Creek. And so that is traditionally another type of assessment that we've done. That was not what was asked here, but is going to show up in the recommendations. So moving on to the next slide, just to give you a little bit about myself and my team. You can see the names on the screen. 4 of us, again, are all over the country. MGT has about 350 employees, but the 4 of us were the ones leading this project, bringing a variety of skill sets and expertise to this project. And so while I will give a high-level overview of the project, and you have the report that gives a lot more detail, some of my partners who aren't here today have more in-depth knowledge of different components. I served as the executive in charge and project manager and led the development of the DEI action plan, which is another term we use for a strategic plan for this project. So now, going over what the project looked like. As you heard earlier, our approach was to conduct an equity audit or an equity assessment of both human resources and police community relations. We're going to dive into what it looked like for phase one before going into phase two. What I will say is that human resources, although very, very large, it does not encapsulate the entire organization. There were a lot of findings, as you can imagine, through our assessment about the organization, but it was focused more specifically on the human resources department. So diving into phase one, we started with establishing goals, and so we worked hand in hand to establish goals for the project. We did a literature review, and so we always identify a few other municipalities that are similar in either size or demographic makeup as part of our process, and then we analyze a host of policies. As you can imagine, we did not look at every single policy in the HR department, but we did try to highlight those that have the biggest impact as it relates to a culture of equity and inclusion for the city. The third step was analyzing data, which we did through our engagement. And so through focus groups and surveys, we got a host of qualitative data that was all part of our assessment. And then through all of that, we created our draft report and a series of recommendations prior to meeting with a diverse stakeholder group made up of the city manager, team, and the African American Collaborative, as you heard earlier, and that resulted in the development, a high-level development of an action plan. So a few details about the process. For the staff engagement, we identified 14, or facilitated 14 different employee focus groups. Everyone in the organization was invited to participate in the survey. We had 6 weeks in which the survey was available. It had 156 responses. The number of questions on the screen relates to this topic that you see on the left. And so we identified 7 or 8 different topics and had a host of questions relating to each of those topics. And you can see on the screen here some of the findings. We broke up our findings between the feedback from the employees versus our analysis of policy and practice. At a high level, we wanted to see that rights granted to workers are communicated directly. That was a finding that is important, that while employees have rights, they're not always aware of them. So really focusing on the communication to employees about what their rights are. Whistleblower protections, very important within anti-harassment policies. But Battle Creek should consider including a specific clause around anti-retaliation. And so there was some language that talked about the protections, but not sufficient language around how to ensure that there's not retaliation if someone was to make a claim regarding any kind of equity issue or just their experience as an employee as a whole. And then the third major finding from our policy and practice review was that the civil service in Act 78, while it does offer barriers towards equity and should be considered, one of our recommendations is that the city considers how they can repeal the act because of the barriers to equity in terms of staffing that creates. On the employee feedback side, again, this is taken both from the survey results as well as the focus groups in which we heard directly from employees. 3 significant findings, what recommendations. One is to, can you go back one slide? Sorry, thank you. The second, well, one of the findings was that there is a commitment from the city regarding the principle of DEI, and it's been a heightened commitment over the last several years, not just evidenced by this assessment itself, but by some other moves and initiatives the city has made. At the same time, more can be done to ensure strong communication, particularly to city employees and potential city employees. One of the areas of focus was ensuring that the diversity or the makeup of the city staff represented the Battle Creek community. In a large part, there's more work to be done there. The challenge sometimes is not just hiring practices, but also awareness of the general public around what kind of positions are available, what kind of qualifications are available.
I'm sorry, I need to go back to the Act 78. Clearly, that's discrimination. Is there any other alternative besides the vote to repeal? Have you seen any examples in any other communities?
Not something that's substantial in terms of having a meaningful impact, and so repealing it is the most ideal. It's one thing that we've talked at length about.
Yeah, and I don't want to step on Jill's toes here, but in Michigan, the only way to repeal Act 78 is a vote of the people. Did I say that correctly? So the Battle Creek voters would have to vote to repeal Act 78 and our use for it in the fire department.
There's no case law that allows us to show that it discriminates?
I can't answer that, I'll have to defer.
I haven't seen any. I haven't researched that exhaustively, but it has to be a vote to rescind it.
Thank you. Thank you, Lamont, sorry.
No, not a problem. You'll see it. I'm not reading every word on the slide, but it clearly requires an education campaign to educate folks about both the meaning of it, the impact of it, how it does discriminate. Ideally, that kind of communication, public understanding and awareness of it, ideally would lead to the ideal result. But other legal avenues would have to be explored to see if there is something else besides that. But as of right now, our understanding is that the public vote is the only way to remove it.
One more question. Have you seen in the past where you've had educational campaigns and then the public vote, is there opposition to it?
I'll say there's almost always opposition when you're talking politically. We have had projects specifically with school districts where the education of the benefit of a referendum being passed was such that the public did vote for it. That's a little bit different, obviously, than repealing a act like this one. But certainly public awareness and the extent to which they are fully educated almost often has the ideal result if done well.
Mayor, if I may, I'm just, to start the education now, if there are people watching or folks in the audience who don't understand what 78 is, could you describe it very briefly? That'd be allowable.
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to describe
I'll let
it.
our city manager, so I don't.
I'll do my best. In just simple terms, Act 78 is a civil service commission. For the city of Battle Creek, it only pertains to the fire department, and it's the hiring and promotional processes within the fire department as defined in Act 78.
Thank you.
That's a very simple explanation.
Last question, Lamont, on this issue. What do you envision the process taking? 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years?
I wouldn't say it has to be that long. I think part of our recommendation that you'll see at the very end is identifying or crafting the ideal strategy. I mean, we've all been exposed to marketing campaigns that are blasted all over TV and internet that get our attention. And so I would say it's less about the time it takes and more about the quality of the approach and the commitment of elected officials and city leaders. I think the extent to which more political leaders are demonstrating their favor towards something and demonstrating the immediate and drastic positive impact it has on a community, even though you may have some opposition, it's not often that we see a group of people all pushing the same direction. And so the extent to which we can get closer to that is going to drastically increase the likelihood of it having a positive impact. And if that's the case, it doesn't have to take a lot of time.
Thank you, Lamont.
Mayor, if I may.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you. Lamont, so have you tried this process with any other communities? This type of a process?
An act like this specifically,
Yes.
no. We have not seen
Okay.
this in other
Okay.
municipalities. This is
Yes.
a unique one.
Okay.
Again, we've seen it in school districts when we were trying to get a referendum passed or trying to raise taxes, things like that, but not for repeal of something like this.
Someone has to be first.
That is the benefit of us doing that kind of peer review. And so you see some similarities and differences between other municipalities, but this is definitely a unique one.
Any other questions, Lamont, at this time? Proceed.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And then just jumping right to the recommendations, some of which I alluded to. One is to hire a DEI officer, someone who has the experience, the skill set to champion DEI throughout the organization. But one thing that we told the city manager and team is that it's not someone who strictly owns the culture themselves. It is someone who is helping create the plan and then spread, but everyone owns it. And so part of our work was to do some research on what that looks like. And so we did propose a position in helping the city understand exactly what that could look like as part of the new organizational chart. The second one we just spoke about is the recommendation is to eliminate Act 78 through a charter amendment after sponsoring a very comprehensive joint education and marketing campaign. And the third one is to review and revise job descriptions, specifically regarding education experience requirements. There are still many jobs that may require, the job description requires a college degree or a master's degree that's not necessary. And so taking a comprehensive look at those requirements, substituting experience in place of that, allows for a bigger pool of residents who can qualify for particular roles. Recommendations that are based on employee feedback. One is to create actionable and measurable diversity inclusion initiatives that transcend throughout the organization. Again, things like having an employee resource groups where people have access to other folks and can kind of share. It can benefit the organization, but it has to be pervasive throughout the organization and not just be a side initiative, if you will. The second one is to conduct DI training at all levels with an emphasis on having difficult conversations. One of the barriers to DEI advancement is our own mentality, our own mindsets, our own experiences, and the challenge with having that difficult conversation with a colleague or a peer. And so marrying those two together is critical. And what I think is written in the report is an actual plan. So it's not just we're going to have everyone come together for a 2-hour training on one day and that's it. It should be an ongoing plan that helps people continue to advance their understanding, their sensitivity, their cultural awareness for all employees. And the third one is to partner with high schools and community colleges to create career pathways. And so while adjusting job description requirements can provide more opportunity, actually creating pathways for students as they're going through high school careers can create a pipeline to ensure that you have larger quantity as well as breadth of residents, again, who are eligible.
Nice question, Mayor.
Go ahead.
Lamont, I'm curious around either employee feedback or your recommendations around policy and practice, that if there is training, is it best practice or suggested that then what people are being trained on becomes part of their evaluations or assessments as employees?
It's a fantastic question, and there's a couple of different answers to that. Yes, you would certainly want to start with an assessment, figure out what the needs of the organization are, and then craft a training plan around that. And then that training plan can differentiate training for leaders versus staff versus new hires, particularly as people get promoted into leadership roles. You know, the understanding you need to have of various cultures is heightened when now you're responsible for several direct reports. And so that just gives an example of how you want to differentiate the training while also making it consistent for all. And just going back to the previous point, it should not be a one-size-fits-all or a one-time opportunity. The best way to hold people accountable to the learning that you hope they receive from the training is like anything else. If you want to hold people accountable to it, you have to measure it. And so it is a recommendation based on best practice that organizational evaluation tools, individual employee evaluation tools are aligned with the organization's goals towards equity. And so if creating an inclusive culture is the wish of the city, then managers should also be held accountable to the extent to which individuals on their team feel like they are valued and included. So that is certainly an extension of the recommendation.
Thank you.
Carla?
Thank you. This might be for Rebecca. Rebecca, what is the percentages of the African-American employees with the city?
That's a great question. It came up in the Human Relations Board, and I'm a little embarrassed to say we're having a difficult time extracting it out of our HRIS, Human Resources Information System. It's one of the reasons why we are long overdue to update that system, as well as our financial software, which is part of the city's ARPA projects. So that was a question. So we're having to do a little bit more manual counts of those, and that is certainly on the to-do list for the Human Resources Director. I apologize, I don't have that. It should be simple, and IT's been great. It's just a bit of a deficiency in our older, antiquated system. But that is a very important piece that we will have as we advance the DEI plan.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And just to add on to that, part of accountability to progress is having tangible goals. So you'll see that we kind of allude to that in the action plan, as if you want that to be part of the organization, then you need to measure that. And so what are the percentage goals? Obviously, it doesn't mean you're creating a quota, but it just means that you're holding yourself accountable to the ideal diversity of the staff, particularly if you wanted to match the diversity of the community. Next slide. So at a high level, that is a summary of our approach with our human resources assessment, findings, and recommendations. I want to shift to the police and community relations part of the project. Very, very similar. We started with establishing goals. In this case, it was to identify both internal and external barriers to strong police-community relations and understand how the police department is perceived by the general Battle Creek community. The second step, again, was literature review, followed by policy review of key policies within the police department. And then taking all of that input to adding to that community feedback through community meetings, and then based on that assessment, making recommendations, and then working with 8 individuals to create an action plan. I want to share with you the type of feedback that we received, and so you can see the meeting dates. There were 6 different methods for people to give feedback. 2 in-person community meetings. They're open to the public. 2 virtual meetings. And then we also opened up a voicemail line, so anyone could call in and leave a voicemail message, as well as an email for individuals. Overall, we had 61 residents provide feedback, and you'll see a high-level summary of what we heard on the next slide. From our findings from our policy and practice review, we found that the main finding is that anti-harassment rules are spread across 2 different places within the policies while addressing a similar situation. And so while the police department is obviously large, we found that some of the policies may have counteracted with each other and weren't aligned with each other, as you can see an example on the slide there. That was one of the biggest findings. From the community, and you can obviously read for yourself, but the community is concerned with the frequency of communication, as well as their perceived unwillingness of younger officers to have friendly, get-to-know-you type of conversations. And in general, the community felt like any conversation they were having were after something happened or kind of more antagonistic versus just getting to know the community, particularly for folks who are newer to the force. The suspension of programs like the Cops and Clergy Alliance or the Citizens Police Academy, which is unfortunate due to the pandemic, certainly increased public perception of not doing enough. And so there's an opportunity there to re-implement programs, enact new programs, to really build the relationship and connection with the community. And then regarding cultural awareness training and training related to individuals with disabilities, the folks who responded felt that more training is necessary while also being transparent. They felt like it was important for the city to be transparent with who participated in the training sessions. And there's also feedback that you'll see in the report around if there are consequences for police officers, that should also be made more transparent as well as consequences. few of the recommendations, and again, these are a high-level overview of recommendations. There are a lot more details and a lot more recommendations in the full report. One is, again, the anti-retaliation policy, making it more uniform, so there's not loopholes in the policy and how it's understood and implemented. And to continue and even implement new programs that really build further awareness and connection with the community. From the residents that we spoke to, again, publicizing the types of trainings that are required as well as who attends, ensuring cadets in the police academy are required to volunteer and participate in cultural events within different pockets of the community. It was interesting having some conversations. Some folks felt like the only time they see a police officer is in a uniform when they're kind of on that defensive posture, as opposed to showing up at a community event, maybe identifying that they're a police officer, but not always in uniform, just building that relationship with the community so that just creates a more positive, trusting environment that, as you can imagine, has significant impact for the long term. Third recommendation is actually creating a citizens review board to ensure accountability. So I mentioned before the idea the community desired to have better awareness of incidents, there were unfortunate incidents or wrongdoing, how police are held accountable to that. It was a specific desire.
How big would that board be?
Typically 8 to 12 individuals.
Okay.
And then aligned with that is, again, creating transparency in statistics, stops, arrests, convictions, et cetera, so that it's another way for the public to be able to hold police officers accountable to proper conduct.
Was there a recommendation? I'm sorry.
Go right ahead, go right ahead.
Was there a recommendation that that data be disaggregated by race or area geographically?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And one of the challenges that we talked about specifically on the human resources side, is that we know there are different bargaining units, and we know that some of those things can be a challenge. But like anything else, the details are in the data, the story sometimes can get lost if you don't have specifics. And so that is a recommendation.
Hi. Looking at the board, as you spoke about, what would that look like? I mean, who would be involved on that board? Who would you like to see?
I mean, we can certainly do more research on what that would look like, but ideally a citizens review board, and quite frankly, I would call it a residents review board.
Oh.
Another way to make it more inclusive. But it'd be made up of residents of the community who are able to give input.
Okay.
And so just like we worked hand in hand with the African American Collaborative throughout this project, they were at the table when we were interviewed. They were at the table through different parts of the project. They were at the table, not just listening, but full engagement in the development of the plan. You'll see on the next slide. Ideally, that review board is able to hear and give input. Doesn't mean that what they say, is gold,
Sure.
if you will, but there's input. So the city, the police department leaders have that input.
So the residents of the city is what you would
That's correct.
be, okay,
That's
thank
correct.
you.
And we've also created other types of task force that either combine residents with staff members.
Yeah.
And so, there's pros and cons to either. And so it's something that we can certainly, I would recommend the city take a look at.
Yep. Commissioner Reynolds, the Human Relations Board has been reviewing a proposal from the NAACP as well as others around a Citizens or Resident Review Board and trying to advance that in hopes that it gets to the commission soon. There's just some work that needs to be done, including a survey that the Human Relations Board has requested so that we get more input from the community beyond the 61 folks who showed up to the sessions, just about the composition of the board, who would be interested, what do they hope its objectives are, so that we can at least go into this with a much, deeper sense of authentic knowledge of what the community wants.
Thank you, Commissioner.
And that's a perfect segue to one aspect of the plan. And so, again, we were asked to evaluate two different aspects of the city. One was HR and one was police community relations. You're going to see two different plans. You go to the next slide. Keep going. Before we get to the plan, how do we create the plan? And so, myself, Rebecca, and team firmly believe in engagement and not just giving the city something, but fully engaging with the community. In this case, if there were 4 members of the African American Collaborative who met with Chief Blocker, Michelle Hall, Ted, and Rebecca 4 times over the month of May to create the 2 different plans. So a lot of engagement from both sides. And you'll see in the next slide a high-level overview of the plan. So I think you have the PDF of this. Each of these slides is just one item, just so you can see that. But we basically looked at all the feedback from the report, all of MGT's recommendations. We also asked each of the 8 individuals to identify their own recommendations based on their knowledge of the city, their knowledge of what was in the report, and put that together. I led them through a process to narrow their focus, categorize, ideally, and then ultimately identifying 4 to 5 strategic priorities with specific initiatives underneath each one. I will say that each of these also has a timeline associated with it of the next 3 years about ideally when each one gets started, either this fall, next spring, et cetera, so that the city kind of holding themselves accountable to implementation. But at a high level, the first priority was embedding a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the fabric of all Battle Creek departments, not just HR. How do you do that? One is establish the dedicated role, which we talked about. So ideally, over the next, I believe, 8 months, creating some executive level leadership role that focuses on DEI, creating a comprehensive DEI training plan, as I alluded to earlier, and then including DEI metrics. So someone asked earlier about how do you hold folks accountable. Ideally, you have specific individual, department, and organization-wide metrics of performance that you're holding yourself accountable to. The second priority is align policies and practices with DEI principles. Again, a lot of times organizations hire a DEI officer or have an initiative, and that's kind of a one-off item that doesn't truly transcend the entire organization. So in addition to having a dedicated leadership role, it's also about having those principles really transcend throughout the organization. How do you do that? One is conducting a comprehensive review and updating of key HR policies, modernizing the administrative code to be more equity focused, and ensuring compensation equity throughout the organization. We found that while talent systems themselves may be a challenge in getting people into the door, making sure that once people are here, there's equitable compensation, regardless of gender, race, or any other demographic marker. Third strategic priority, leveraging effective communication to drive inclusion and positive change, ensuring broad accessibility for city staff within the organization, so making sure there's accessibility through email and other channels was critical, and maximizing value opportunities for staff to provide authentic feedback. And so having frequent communication, feedback loops. A lot of times we see organizations have an annual survey. That's good. We don't want to wait 12 months. And so what is the ongoing feedback after an initiative or after a new plan or after a new policy is enacted for staff to get feedback? And then the additional step we would suggest is that the city responds to that feedback. One of the reasons that we often see less engagement in surveys is because people feel like the last time I did it, I didn't hear anything. If it wasn't a good use of my time, I'm not going to spend 18 minutes filling out this survey. And so making sure that there's feedback loops both ways. You're giving staff members the opportunity to provide feedback frequently, and then the city is responding to that with, here is what we heard, here are the actions we're taking, and here's why we're not taking other actions. Both of those elements are really critical to continue to have staff bought in. The fourth strategic priority is diversifying the workforce to be more representative of the Battle Creek community. Doing this by conducting a robust strategy for candidate recruitment, strengthening hiring practices to ensure consistency and equitable opportunity, and elevating the role and impact of Battle Creek's community partners. We know there are a lot of community partners who care and have access sometimes to avenues and sub-communities that the city might not have access to. And so maximizing those relationships and expanding them can be another avenue to not only get access to other potential employees, but also using those partnerships to build further trust is another opportunity. And the fifth one is to execute key actions that advance equity. So this is more of a general kind of cornucopia, if you will, set of actions. One is maximizing efforts to authentically engage. We would hope that if we were to come back in 12 months to do another assessment, that we'd have better engagement because the community feels like there's more channels for feedback, more opportunity, more genuine trust built there. Advocating for broad and diverse involvement by city leaders and elected officials is very, very critical. And then we talked about Act 78. And so we were general with the language. We'd love to say eliminate it. It's not that easy, but certainly advancing discussions, really prioritizing what it means, the impact of it, and what it means from an education and marketing standpoint to take major steps towards ideally removing that act. So at a high level, those are the 5 strategic priorities. You can see that there are 2 or 3 major actions underneath each one. We call those initiatives. And that each one of those has their own set of actions that have to be implemented in order for that to come to fruition. And we were happy to work with the same committee, as well as Chief Blocker, who is fantastic, to create an action plan for advancing police and community relations. The first priority is building trust through effective listening, communication, and transparency between the police department and the community, ensuring transparency regarding with the public regarding key statistics and initiatives, and developing a continuous feedback loop between the community and the police department. One of the things that I heard was, when something did happen, if there was a police involved incident, the community was quick to want to have a conversation. We would say it shouldn't take the incident to have the conversation. The community should have opportunities to frequently dialogue, not just hear what the police department is doing, but to give input, give feedback, give perspective. That's how you build awareness, comfort, trust, and then you have a better community going forward because of that.
Lamont, if I might, Mayor, do you have examples in cities where they do that effectively?
We had a project in Charlottesville, Virginia, if you remember the incident in Charlottesville a few years ago. So MGT was brought in to do an assessment of policing there. And so I can't say they had a strong record of performance before that, but going forward, they were very intentional in that plan to create targeted outreach and having a cadence. And so monthly, there were community meetings in different parts of the community where it wasn't just the chief, or it wasn't just one individual, it was multiple individuals who were there listening and engaging. They also identified what community events are happening and making sure there was a presence, not to police the activity, but to dialogue and receive feedback. And so the further recommendation here in terms of what that can look like is developing almost your own calendar. You have a strategy around how you are soliciting feedback, demonstrating presence, and intentionally building those relationships is critical.
Thank you.
Second priority is strengthening multicultural awareness, competency, and lens in which members of the police department operate. So again, authentic engagement with the Battle Creek community. Creating and implementing a comprehensive training plan for all members of the police department, and implementing progress monitoring protocol to track the fidelity and effectiveness of a plan. And so you heard me say training plan frequently this evening. It's one thing to have a one-time training. It's another thing to have a comprehensive ongoing set of trainings. It's a whole other improvement to then track implementation fidelity. So how effective is the training, and are in this case, the police department members demonstrating understanding, competency based on the learnings that took place in that training plan, and then heightened behavior, actions, et cetera. And so that is kind of the full scale from training to accountability that leads to enhanced performance that we would recommend.
So I see, excuse me, I see that we got responses from 61 residents. Did we engage with the officers on the opposite end of things?
We did not. So this was specifically getting community feedback. You're going to see another, one of the recommendations is to do a comprehensive external assessment. So again, I started at the top by saying that this was an internal focus assessment. We did get community input regarding relations, but not regarding overall experience. And so if we were to do that, we would certainly want to talk to not just communities, members on a wider variety, but in this case, getting police officer input on what are the barriers internally that they may be facing, or the attitudes that could be leading to some of the positive or negative actions. So we did not take that step.
Thank you.
Third strategic priority, strengthening policies, HR systems, and processes. One thing we did note is that while the police department is a part of the city, there are two different HR departments. And so here it was regarding, the first one was improving policies that support the social and emotional health and well-being of police officers, understanding that the more stress and lack of mental support they have, the more that can also lead to less than desirable conduct. Ensuring the workforce is demographically aligned, and so this is one that was similar across both, not just the Battle Creek staff, but also the police department workforce as well. And then we spoke earlier about supporting the development of a citizens review board. You can imagine there would be a lot of steps underneath that, but we thought that was, well, I should say, the committee felt like that was a critical aspect of the plan that they wanted for the city, is to ensure that at some point there is a citizens review board. And the fourth and final strategic priority is maximizing joint operations with internal city departments and external partners. This kind of has several different interpretations. One is to expand partnerships and impact of residents and community organizations. They exist, they are there. I think there's an opportunity to further enhance that. But there's also internal city departments that could have better alignment, that could ultimately enhance the effectiveness and outcomes of both the city and the police department, as well as focusing on enhancing availability and access to public service supports. We have seen that it is not uncommon for a municipality to have services available for their residents that are underutilized because of lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, or lack of trust. And so the police department, working with the other city departments to maximize that, we felt like would be well, I should say the committee felt that that's an important aspect of the plan that should be instituted. There's a whole lot more pages in the report that you received, but at a high level, those two one-pagers that I reviewed is the action plan. Again, there's timelines and a whole lot of other action steps to follow that, but that is what the committee decided was important. I had the pleasure of working with you all and helping facilitate that, and think that, again, this is one step, not the final step, not the ultimate step, but one major step towards the city getting where it wants to get to.
Comments for Lamont or the committee? I would like to first of all thank Commissioner Wilson for her leadership. I know this has been a long endeavor, but I don't know if we'd be here today with this presentation without your leadership,
No, thank
Commissioner,
you.
so thank you.
Thank you.
Secondly, I want to thank Rebecca Fleury and her staff for their acceptance to take this on. This is not an easy thing to do. I don't think with other city managers we would have taken it on. And I hate to say that, but I'm just being honest. And I thank you for your leadership in order to accomplish what we've done. Finally, Lamont, you've made it easy to understand. I appreciate your organization. The first time that I've met anyone from your firm, you're doing a good job. Comments of the rest of the commission? Carla, you're getting ready to say something? No. Okay.
But it was a great presentation. Thank you. And I also want to thank the African American Collaborative as well, who partook in this approach. Thank you.
Commissioner Benica?
Yes, sorry, I was chewing. Yes, I definitely want to thank you for all the hard work. Like, as someone who works in racial healing facilitation, this is a great start, and I'm looking forward to the work that's coming from that. And thank you for, like, having the open-mindedness to even approach a project like this, because it is crucial work, and it is essential to the growth and the better practices that are going to come out of our city, so.
Any other comments by the commission? Once again, thank you very much, Lamont. We appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll see you more.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Are there any other public comments at this time? Seeing none, we'll declare the workshop closed, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much for attending.